It's such a pleasure to be able to present a little bit about myself, and I promise not to drone on. But I think just the general gist of the introduction or today's presentation, I'll probably talk a little bit about myself and my own journey, a little bit about the work that I'm currently doing at Bruner Cott Architects, as well as at my previous life. So my journey so far has been interesting. I was an undergrad at Carnegie Mellon, so I did my B.Arch there. Then I moved to Texas. I worked at Lake Flato a little bit for about a year. I was at the GSD for the Harvard Graduate School of Design for my graduate work. And then I loved Boston so much that I decided to stay. So I've been at UTO, which is an architecture and planning firm based here in Boston, as a building performance specialist, and also here at Bruner Cott Architects, where I was before joining UTO, and then they asked me to come back. So that's my journey so far. And I think what's important when talking about your career trajectory is really to acknowledge the people, professors, mentors, and colleagues that really shaped my experience. And I'm very grateful to them for all of their mentorship and advice at different points of my career. So just wanted to point out a few people, specifically Vivian Lofness, Professor Vivian Lofness at Carnegie Mellon has been a big influence on myself and a lot of practitioners. You know, she used to teach, I think she is still teaching the 101 course on sustainability that all undergraduates have to take. So that's really a big introduction. John Folan who is now at the University of Arkansas, has also been a big mentor. He led the design build program at Carnegie Mellon during my time there. Heather Holdridge at Lake Flato is their director of sustainable design. And at the Graduate School of Design, Professor Holly Samuelson has also been a big influence, also a Carnegie Mellon grad, so shout out there. At UTL, Jeff Geisinger, who's the director of sustainable design there, really oversees all their passive house work, and it's been an incredible honor to be able to work with him. Here at Bruner Cott Architects, both Jasons are the two partners of the firm, and I really am indebted to them for just their guidance and their mentorship, and Lawrence Chang, who's also one of the principals here at the office. So just a quick jump into a little bit about how I got interested in sustainability. As an undergrad, what is sustainability? And so, I had no idea. I was in my third year. And then we all had to take this 101 course at Carnegie Mellon called Environmental Design. And really, it was a jump into talking about retrofits. And so the program was to look at a house of your choosing. So I looked at the house I was living in Pittsburgh, and starting to understand a little bit about what summer and winter events mean, what do shadows mean, what does daylighting mean, but still, really at an undergraduate level, and then having to do some calculations. What's R value? What's U value? What does retrofits look like? And I think looking back, almost a decade later, it really shapes some of the passive house knowledge that I've come to understand and have a deeper and a deeper knowledge of today. And through my undergrad time, Carnegie Mellon, I think, to really give them credit, has a very strong sustainability program. And so, like people that have come before and after me, I was really drawn to the sustainability initiatives there, particularly that was done in the graduate level. So I was able to interact with some professors like Vivian and Kipo at the graduate level during my time there as an undergrad, to do some lighting analysis, some daylighting work, but at the same time, having first exposure to software and certain things that are a little bit outside of, what we typically do in architecture school, some understanding of HVAC systems and, or domestic hot water. So this was an example of a competition that I worked on. So after I finished my time at Carnegie Mellon, I took the bold move of deciding to move down to Texas. I'd never been that far south before, and worked at Lake Flato. So that was really my first foray into understanding what sustainability in practice meant from a professional perspective. So, on the right, on the left, there we did do some analysis of, site conditions, but at the same time on the right, really beginning to understand who are the stakeholders who are involved in design charrettes, like what does it mean to be an architect sort of involved in this larger community, the architecture, engineering, construction, AEC community, and and really what that meant from a practice perspective. And I think as an intern fresh out from undergrad, it was really a very humbling experience to be able to work at such a well-established firm. So, kudos to Lake Flato and the work that they're doing, and they're still the cutting edge today. And so it was really such a humbling experience. In graduate school, moving back up to the Northeast, I was really interested in getting into the details, or perhaps getting to the weeds of what it means to energy model. So, like in architecture school and in practice, like we understand sustainability design principles, we understand the foundations, the basics. I think for folks, as a sidetrack, for folks who have sort of been engaged in sustainability practice, like Sun, Wind, and Light, the book is like the fundamental really of understanding sustainability. But I was really interested in understanding at a deeper level, how to energy model, right? So understanding what the iterative processes are from passive to active strategies, what are the steps for undertaking energy modeling. So I was, exposed to softwares like Energy Plus and Diva for daylighting at that time, which is, I think folks still use today, and, like understanding what the metrics are. In addition to energy modeling, there was also some, there are also opportunities for me to understand a little bit more about natural ventilation, and shout out to Alejandra Menchaca for that, who was an excellent instructor at while I was in school. And so really understanding what the fundamentals of natural ventilation are, understanding certain modeling techniques, like computational fluid dynamics modeling, which is really way above my head, but just really a foundational understanding, and how these software packages really interact with each other from, like as shown on the left-hand side, how energy modeling software, CFD software, and daylighting software really kind of integrate to, to have a holistic energy modeling process. So after I finished graduate school, like some of my colleagues, the dilemma was, do I go into sustainability practice, become a sustainability consultant, or do I go back and work for an architecture firm? So I think the little architect in me was really, had really decided, well, you've gone through architecture school, it's important to get licensed. And so I went and worked for an architecture firm here in Boston. So I was at Bruner, and that was really introduction to affordable housing projects. So I've had some housing experience through my time in undergrad and at Lake Flato, but really at Bruner, it was the opportunity to work on affordable housing projects. And for folks who are Massachusetts-based, now Passive Houses Code and, affordable housing projects really are at the forefront of that because of QAP requirements, to get funding. So this was really my first foray into working on affordable housing projects. So, in addition to some of the architectural strategies, like sustainability is always at the forefront of what we're thinking of here at Bruner. And and really looking at what it means to create places for people, with that are, that allow them to have dignity in the housing that they live in. And so how does all that tie into Passive House? I think that's an important part of what the Passive House Accelerator does. And I'd like to spend a little bit more time to talk about that synthesis with affordable housing and passive house. And I was really fortunate to experience that in professional practice during my time at UTIL as a building performance specialist. So on the left are some of the affordable housing projects in Boston and Maine that I was privileged to be able to be a part of. And on the right really is how UTIL structures itself as both a firm that provides architectural services, but also passive house and CPHC services. So the top diagram really looks at what the energy modeling processes are, and together with what the CPHC responsibilities are. And then the bottom half really looks at what we as architects might more typically look at during an affordable housing design process, from zoning and permitting to funding deadlines to construction processes. The bottom diagram, just to throw it in there, I think is interesting because as an architect, we look at design and we look at building massing and all the things that we're familiar with. From a passive house perspective, one interesting thing that I learned working with Jeff at UTIL was really to look at metering decisions. And, people might think, oh, metering is, like, do we really have to think about that early? The answer is yes, because, it does affect things like what your HVAC design strategies are, how much roof space do you have, and what are some of the costs, owner or tenant costs are associated with affordable housing design projects where, costs and how much a tenant pays is always something that we have to be aware of. And so at UTIL, to maybe talk about two project examples really quickly, we of course have, as architects, like to do some drawing. I won't take credit for the drawing because that's Jeff's beautiful sketch, but really looking at some of the passive house strategies from a holistic perspective. And of course, also doing the WUFI modeling. So with my background in undergraduate and graduate school, learning how to model in the WUFI platform and to understand, what are some of the drivers for passive house design, both passive and active, I think was something that I was very privileged to have the opportunity to apply towards during my time there. And, in addition to modeling, we would also look at things that I think are familiar to the audience, things like what are the building envelope recommendations, things like R value, U values for different components like walls, floors, roofs, specific to the New England area and to climate zone 5A that we're in. Things like appliances, but also things that have overlap with the MEP consultant that, that was maybe a little newer to me. Things like what kind of mechanical ventilation, what kind of HVAC systems are we looking at? And of course, the other thing that's very important in passive house design is are things like air tightness and compartmentalization for your thermal bridging, and air tightness considerations in the building, any corners, intersections, right? So where the synthesis comes in is during my time at UTIL, in addition to my building performance specialist work, I was also involved in, getting into the details, drawing them, understanding what the intersections are. So in this case, really looking at what are some of the key intersections, from left to right, foundations, walls to soffits, walls to roofs, and of course, windows are a big thing because where you put your window in your thermal boundary is quite important from a passive house consideration. And of course, inputting that into WUFI and understanding what the relationships are. And I think working at a place like UTL, oops, sorry about that. I think my screen just went blank. I think it's, that's really important to, to understand. And so really having the architectural knowledge and the building science knowledge to really work back and forth with the teams, I think was really something that was challenging, but also fulfilling at the same time. Another project that I'll talk about really quickly during my time at UTL, a little different in scale and form. But in this particular example was really understanding, because there's a lot of sloping roofs and roof areas in this project, really understanding what are some of the, directions that that we could take from a thermal boundary perspective, like looking at whether we could do a cold roof versus a hot roof. Is it semi-conditioned or vaulted, or or using the upper floor as a thermal boundary, and what are some of the different options that come with that? What are some of the materials that we're using? Is it XPS, on the roof, or EPS, or is it spray foam, and sort of looking at the give and takes there, because as we know, spray foam has high global warming potential from an embodied carbon perspective, so also kind of taking that into account. So after my time at UTL, Bruner Cott asked me to come back, and I was like, sure, that's great, and so what does it mean to, sort of come full circle, I guess, and in my current role as an architect here at Bruner Cott, really taking what I've learned from my experiences, and putting that into professional practice. So I was very fortunate to work on 288 Harrison, which is a Bruner Cott's first FIAS design certified project that's now under construction here in Boston, in Chinatown. And some of the principles that I had learned from my previous experiences do apply. So again, windows are an important part of the passive house discussion. But at the same time, how do we produce drawings that can be used on projects, but also to help the contractor and stakeholders that we're working with understand sequencing, in addition to maybe on site, what, like doing a mock-up on site, or doing a, like a window taping sequencing session on site. Like, how do we produce drawings that help us as architects to begin to understand what those steps are? So this is an example of that. Other examples, I think, are really at some of the key details in projects. So on the left, for podium projects, which, whether it's concrete or steel podium below and wood frame construction on the top, like how do we look at those transitions? On the right, it's looking at your wall to foundation details. And I think right off the bat, I'll say is there are some preferred approaches, but we're all still learning. And, I will by no means say these are 100% correct. There are things in the field that we're noticing that might not be correct, or things that might have to be done differently with sequencing. But I think putting these diagrams together really helps us to understand what those pinch points are and how we're able to figure them out on site. The last part of my presentation, because I think we want to leave some time for Q&As, to really talk a little bit beyond passive house. So for folks who have worked a lot in passive house, I think we know that it has, like any program, there are strengths and weaknesses. And I think it's important for us as practitioners to look at sustainability from a holistic perspective. And so in addition to passive house work. Bruner has also been a leader in the Living Building Challenge. And so I like to share two examples of that and to talk a little bit about what make these projects unique beyond the the energy side that we're all familiar with, and enclosures with passive house. So the first example I'll talk about is the current center, which was done a couple of years back here in Amherst, Massachusetts. And what is really interesting about this project, in addition to the EUI and energy modeling and thermal and wall assemblies that we've talked about with passive houses, really to look at the holistic picture that the LBC standard really requires us as practitioners to look at. So in this example, I think what's interesting to talk about is really how water is managed on the project. And I think one of the limitations of being on a small site, and if I butcher this, I apologize to the folks at Bruner, but I think, looking at how the building manages water in addition to what we've already talked about, I think is also really important. And so just to point out a few things quickly here for the current project is really an understanding of how we tackle rainwater harvesting, what it means to use composting toilets, which from my understanding really has the ability to reduce your potable water use significantly, and also what it means to reclaim and reuse gray water on the site, because from my understanding, LBC really requires you to manage that on site. Now, with a building that's on with a smaller building that's on a smaller site, there are associated challenges with that. And what we learned at Bruner and applying it to a larger project. So here's an example of a project that's still under construction. It's the Living Village graduate student residence at the Yale Divinity School. Slightly different context it's also on a campus, but the building context and the site strategies and landscaping strategies for this project's a little bit different. But again, to jump into the water discussion, I think we're also looking at similar strategies like rainwater harvesting and wastewater reclamation and reuse. But because of the larger site context that this project is working with, I think, we're able to apply lessons that we have learned on current towards working on the Yale project. So I think holistically, I bring up water as an example of something that I think we should address because, that's something that, I think when we look at sustainability holistically, in addition to energy consumption, our thermal performance, our EUI, I think water is something that has traditionally been looked at a little bit less in holistic sustainable design. And, I think it's important to talk a little bit more about that, of course, in addition to embodied carbon and other things that, that we as an industry are talking about. So to kind of wrap up, I think it's our transition seamless? No, there are not. There are definitely challenges. So I think, from an academic to career transition, 3 points I think I like to put out there. Understanding the theory is important. I think it would have been more difficult for me to understand passive house principles or building science principles without really first understanding what are the fundamental things that we as architects need to know from a sustainability perspective. So your 101 training, undergraduate training, I think is really important. The second thing is really to try out something that you might be interested in. So for me, it was trying out what it means to be a building performance specialist, what it means to do energy modeling. And the third really is to seek advice from your professors, colleagues, and mentors. Absolutely important. They are really the folks that will influence you in many more ways than you can imagine, and to really pay it forward. So I think for me personally, I think it's important to mentor, whether it's younger architects and designers at the office that I'm currently working at, or to be involved to really, you know, empower the next generation to look at, to be interested in the things that are shaping our built environment today. The second point, also with 3 accompanying points, is really about interdisciplinary knowledge exchange. Ooh, sounds a little intense, but really it's about knowing how a building comes together, which is why I enjoy being an architect and still am learning about that, especially for passive house projects. I think a professor of mine in school really kind of used the analogy of juggling balls. So the longer you are in practice, the more balls you have to juggle. You know, you might start off with design and massing and architectural aesthetics. Then you have to work with consultants. Then you have to look at code. You have to look at permitting and passive house. So really understanding all of that and building upon your knowledge is important. Leaning on your consultants, so engineers, your CPHC, your passive house verifier, they're important too because they know stuff that you don't. And it's okay to ask questions. Ask questions on site, ask questions to your consultants because you don't know everything. A lot of architects think they do, but they don't. So just, I know that's a bit controversial, but just putting it out there. And the last portion is really considerations for passive house multifamily projects. I might be preaching to the choir here, but really early stage coordination with the integrated design team is absolutely important. And so in Massachusetts, we have a passive house feasibility study that happens pretty early on in the process. And it's also a requirement for passive house funding. So somebody from, I think, on the passive house side will sit in for one of those presentations for the passive house feasibility study presentation to, you know, to assess the project team and so that everyone's on the same page when it comes to understanding what the design objectives and goals are. The second thing, which I really cannot emphasize enough, is to trace your continuous thermal enclosure. I think some folks have heard it as the red pen that once you put down, it should not leave or be, should be continuous until you arrive back at your point. Like that's really important. And it's also something that we use for passive house boundary determination. And the third is really to pay attention to details at all transitions. And I think that's where, you know, like we are still learning as practitioners, and for a passive house, like that is absolutely critical and important from early in the design stage to when you put your CD set together to when you're talking to your GC or verifier on site to work stuff out. And with that, thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to open up the floor to Q&A or any other questions that folks might have.
Thank you so much, Karno. And I appreciate that you really went into your background and influences and, shout out to Carnegie Mellon for influencing both of us. And, I think it's really important to hear that and kind of understand the perspective of different folks who are coming into passive house. And so for me, it's interesting hearing, from the architect's perspective, kind of like what's drawing you into passive house after, being interested in these concepts generally. And then, being in the right place, right time, speaking of Boston, to put all of this together and what that journey has been like for you. So thank you so much. We do have Carmel on the call, and she's going to kick off the questions, but first we're going to go to Kim with announcements and sponsors.
Thank you so much. Okay, starting with our founding sponsors, we'd like to thank 475 High Performance Building Supply, Ingley Architecture, Glavel Foam Glass Gravel, Minitaire all-in-one box HVAC D units, Partel, Rockwell North America, Stocorp, and Zola Windows and Doors. Our champion sponsors, Buiso, Gradient, Icon Windows and Doors, Intelligent Membranes, PH AirSeal, Proseco, and Source 2050. And next up, our patron sponsors, Brennan, Euroline Windows, Holes Around Systems, Innotech Windows and Doors, Lamelux, RDH Building Science, and Sanderson Design. And last but not least, our stakeholder sponsor is, our partner is NYSERDA. Back over to Carmel and Zoe for Q&A.
Thanks, Kim. And sorry that I was late, community, but Karno, it was so great to hear your presentation, and I think it sparked a lot of the same kind of conversation about what is the responsibility of an architect and a designer in this space. Before we get into the audience questions, we have our standing question, which is, what do you think is next for the future of passive house and high performance design?
Yeah, thanks, Carmel. Actually, that's a really great question, and Michael and a bunch of us were actually talking right before the presentation started. In Massachusetts, because passive houses now code in a way the future is now. But I think what I'll add on a little bit to that is that I think as a practitioner, I'd really like to see like integration of sustainability strategies. And I think passive house is a really good step forward because it challenges the AEC industry to build to higher standards. At the same time, a building is an island, and we are responsible for the built environment. And I think so, really looking at integrating different kinds of sustainability strategies at the building scale, I think is important. But also really talking about more about the urban environment, I think as a system, I think would be an interesting conversation. In Massachusetts, because there are a lot of universities and colleges here, I think that's something that they're able to implement at their campus scale. Cities, I think, are also beginning to talk about some of those things. So, we've been hearing things like microgrids or passive survivability at the urban scale. And, all of that ties into things like resiliency and embodied carbon and all that fun stuff. But not to go off on a tangent, but I think, like looking at all those things are important as well.
No,
You're allowed to go off on tangents.
Yeah. That's definitely all for game here, and I really appreciate that answer, because it's not one that we've gotten before, I don't think, in response to that question, which is like beyond the building, beyond the project. How are you thinking about buildings as communities and infrastructure as communities? So thank you. So thoughtful. We have of Carbon Associates. I'm not sure who of you is on of Carbon Associates, but you're up first for your question if you want to unmute.
Yes, thank you so much for this session. I'm just curious about if building, structural resilience is taken into consideration as kind of another dimension of sustainability beyond the energy efficiency, and what kind of, maybe disruptive or novel solutions you're seeing out there, including adhesives. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And if I just for me to reiterate, so I understand your question, you're asking about structural solutions for on the sustainability track. I think that's an interesting perspective, and one area that the AEC industry has really been looking at is issues of embodied carbon and and carbon use. So not just like operational carbon that that is more tied to like energy consumption, but really being more more aware in the selections that we use. So I think the big ones really, and I'm going to throw in a little NESI pitch here and go off tangent. NESI is the National Northeast Sustainability. Keep butchering them. Northeast Sustainability Energy Association, I think. But there was a presentation at the recent NESI conference here in Boston that looks at what are the key, what are the important structural materials to look at with regards to embodied carbon. So as we know, steel and concrete have really high embodied carbon. And for concrete, there are initiatives to really reduce that, right? Whether it's adjusting our, like cement mixture, Portland cement mixture content, or using less fly ash. I think for steel, like, of course, mass timber is also another associated discussion, because that's, like wood has, like from a carbon perspective is much more gracious, right, than steel. And so I think from a, like passive house, I think it's great from an energy and thermal modeling perspective. I think they're also starting to get into looking at embodied carbon and some of those metrics. I know FIAS has been doing that, which is great. And, I think for us as an architectural practice, we've also been looking at tools to help us understand the impact of materials on an embodied carbon in our projects. So we've been using a tool that I think some folks are familiar with, called Tally, Tally, that really helps us to understand at different stages of the design process, what are the impacts that that structural and other materials have on the building. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Whoever this was of Carbon Associates, did you want to clarify your question? I think part of it had to do with resilience in maybe other ways, but I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, sorry, I maybe wasn't really thorough in my question. I was really talking about the increased prevalence due to anthropogenic, emissions of climate change regarding violent high wind events. So if that perspective on the resilience part of the structure is being increasingly considered on coastal and areas that are susceptible to hurricanes and tornadoes, et cetera. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry for going off on a tangent, but I think, yes, to answer your question about resiliency, I think that's very important. And that was a topic that was centered at the NESI conference. So if folks are interested, I encourage folks to look at some of the slideshows from there. I think both of the keynote presentations really talked about climate resiliency in general. From a structural perspective, I think there are ways in which we as architects can look at how we design our buildings, right? So, podiums or concrete structures that to withstand hurricanes or flooding. I think king tides are another potential concern. I think related to that might not be structural, are putting essential HVAC systems that are elevated above a certain, like floodplain elevation or elevation data. And I know the city of New York has really been looking at that. Boston has been as well. And I think other related resiliency strategies include things like passive survivability. What happens when you lose power to a building, and how do we keep people in those buildings safe, from a thermal perspective, but also from a resiliency and access perspective. So I think, to answer your question, like indirectly, all of those things I think really work hand in hand and structure together with other aspects of design for resiliency, I think are important considerations.
One of the many examples of juggling different aspects of building design, right? There's like structural concerns, there's and I think that was I know I'm technically up next, but I'm gonna slot in some questions that I think Zoe and I both had around how you balance competing needs, or maybe not competing needs, maybe complementary needs around like living building challenge, or around like both structural and thermal concerns. What consultants do you lean on? You touched a lot at the end about this kind of interdisciplinary approach and asking questions, but maybe you can speak specifically about like living building challenge projects that you worked on, and who you had to kind of call in and ask questions for the breadth of topics that covers.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question, Carmel. I think I think my my nutshell answer would be I still don't know that much. And as you said, that's why it's really important to rely on consultants. So I think for LBC specifically, like things like the materials red list or their requirements for that we didn't really talk about this presentation, but requirements for EPDs, for example. I think environmental product declarations, I think, are another important thing, right? So like that's something that Bruner Cott has worked with consultants in the area to really develop that tool. You know, so that's a big part. On the energy side, you know, we rely on our sustainability consultant or energy consultant because, you know, they do the modeling, they understand the processes. And I think there was a question in the chat about firms that do CPHC or in-house energy modeling or not. So I think that's also, you know, depending on how the firm structure is set up, I think that's also another thing to consider. And of course, the next big important thing are really MEP and site. So, you know, like working with landscape architects, with your MEP engineer, I think are really important too. And, you know, they know things that we as architects don't, you know, like what kind of system might work best or what the COP on a air source heat pump might be. I mean, you know, like I think sustainability nerds or architects will probably know some of that, but you know, we still need to rely on our consultants. So I think, you know, for LBC, because of the number of petals that are involved in, you know, so petals, the individual components that are required to meet the LBC certification, I think it's really, you know, rigorous in terms of what are the requirements that you have to meet within each individual petal to get to certification. And I think, you know, in addition to some of the things that we've talked about on the sustainability side, you know, there are also other social, you know, like related metrics that I think they're also part of the LBC process. Not sure if that answers your question, but I think it's really leaning on your consultants, you know, like whoever they might be, and they just bring so much knowledge to the table that we as architects like can know a little bit about, but you know, but really need to lean on them for.
Absolutely. And that kind of leads into Justin Taylor's question, which was, is your office doing the passive house energy modeling in particular, or are you using a consultant for that?
That's a great question. So Bruner Cott we do some in-house energy modeling, but not for passive house. Because I think, you know, like there's training for WUFI specifically, and the CPHC design process, you know, requires passive house specific knowledge. So for that, no. Some firms have decided to go that route and other firms have decided not to. I think for us at Bruner Cott, like sustainability is a key part of how we position ourselves as a firm. And so, you know, energy modeling, although not passive house specific, but say things like studying climate or looking at daylighting or certain, you know, like certain energy modeling protocols that, you know, like we might use, like Ladybug as an example, right, which is in the Rhino platform, really to understand, you know, like what are some of the site strategies that might influence building massing or building design at an early conceptual stage. And then as we proceed through the design process, like say we need to do, you know, like energy modeling for UI, for example, then that's where we might, you know, we'll probably rely on an energy modeling consultant or MEP, you know, or both to guide us through the process. Really, I would say. So most of our efforts have been more focused on early stage design and how those tools can really be used. energy modeling tools and can really be used at that stage.
Yeah, I think a lot of people think of, if an architect or engineer is passive house certified or trained, credentialed, maybe we'll say, then they can do the modeling and certifying for a project, but that's not always what they like to do. When I was doing consulting, and I'm sure Carmel and others can attest to this, we work with architects and engineers who are also credentialed, but their primary job is doing the design work or community engagement or managing the project. So it's still, very helpful to have some of this work done by a consultant because it's a fair amount of work. And yeah, there's definitely specialties in there. And speaking of specialties, so you touched on living building challenge, like Carmel was speaking to, and I think a lot of us just want to hear more about living building challenge. Ben in the chat said, I would love to hear a dedicated presentation on water treatment and recovery at some point. Maybe that's not for right now, but is there anything related to kind of water water management or water treatment with living building challenge that you've run into or have designed around that you'd like to share?
Yeah, that's a great question, Zoe. Thanks for bringing it up. So I will admit that in comparison to some peers at my current firm, my exposure to LBC has been a little bit less. So I think if I give incorrect information, I apologize in advance. And I think you bring up a good point about LBC, because I think from a water management perspective, like LBC or sites, for example, are really, have really set up protocols for us, to guide us through that design process. I think for water specifically, it's about, LBC requires you to manage your water on site. So, that sort of entails the process from what it means to harvest rainwater to how we deal with what kind of potable water is being used in the building, to management of gray water and black water, right? So like that's something that I think like from in architectural design, like our general vocabulary is we're still not really that familiar with those terms. Like we're all familiar with UI and energy and those things. But I think, like composting toilets, I think is an excellent example because that's something that we learned at the current center, where for a project of that scale, like how do you influence potable water consumption in the building and really to install composting toilets, if I remember correctly, reduce the potable water consumption by about 70%, or more. So that's really for a building at any scale, a great first step to be able to achieve that. There are some accompanying infrastructural concerns, right? When you do composting toilets, right? You need to be able to vent out so that it doesn't smell, or, you need to be able to like work on some other things, but like those are like that's one strategy that I think a building at any scale can do. And, I think one challenge is really to persuade a potential client that that's a pathway that we can move forward on. And, I think other areas are really how do we deal with gray water, right? So for example, water that's used to wash your hands is gray water and can be used for irrigation on site or treatment of, like vegetation. So that's where we'll have to work with a landscape architect, right, or MEP to figure out those connections and I think integrated systems. And then how do we deal with black water, right? Water that comes out of the toilet or shower and those kinds of things. Like how do you treat that water? I think an accompanying discussion is working with utilities in the region which the building is in my understanding for Kern and for Yale was that there was discussions that had to happen with the utility, with the water utility companies in those regions to figure out solutions, or even at the state level, like what are some of the, what are some of the discussions that we could, that we could look at, with regards to working with, like state level stakeholders. And I'll admit, like a good chunk of that is really something that I'm less familiar with. But yes, I think that's something that we need to look at. And to apologize, shower is gray water, so that's my mistake. I think the poop that goes in your bathroom, that's black water. So I don't think that's gray water. So
I love how the community comes together and learns together live. That's the point of these. And Karno, that was part of my question, is like, how much do you as a designer, right, with all the responsibility that you have as an architect to bring together these consultants, like how much and how deep do you go into one area? It's hard to catch your focus, let alone have the time to learn and dig in.
Okay, we do have a couple remaining questions. Karno, do you have time beyond 1 o'clock Eastern, or should we cut it at 1?
I have some time. I'm happy to stay and answer questions.
All right, I don't think we'll have too much longer, but we do have a couple questions. I think we have Kelsey Margulies. Did you want to unmute? If not, I will ask the question. I'm not sure if she's still on. Oh, can't use your mic. Okay, no problem. Kelsey was asking, what is your perspective on how the role of an in-house director of sustainability would differ from an energy consultant? If that's something you feel, yeah, you can answer.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I think, and I think as someone who's maybe like a mid-career-ish kind of practitioner, like it's at least at firms that I've worked at, it really depends on like how the architecture firm positions themselves, with regards to, having someone who is their director of sustainability or director of sustainable design, like function within the office. So at other firms, like at UTL, for example, or at Lake Flato, there is a dedicated person who is the director of, sustainable design or director of sustainability, and their roles really can be quite broad. And I think the overarchingly, like they really look at the firm's like sustainability performance as a whole, or they're engaged in, any kind of like throughout the entire process of the firm, whether it's, getting an RFP or getting, like putting a proposal in to address like sustainability initiatives that can be applied through projects. Where I think an energy modeling consultant or an energy consultant's role, I think, from my understanding, is a bit more focused, where they might be looking more at the energy modeling side of things, or say protocols for things like FIAs or PHI if they're doing passive house or LEED or any other kind of metric. So I think, like, that being said, there's a lot of bleeding that happens within this entire sustainability realm. I think it really depends on the size of the firm, what kind of projects the firm is engaged in, and how how maybe firm ownership decides to position themselves with regards to how that's carried out.
Yeah, and I think we had one more question from Michael Ingui, who had to take off, but he was wondering, maybe for the benefit of all, whether there are any programs, maybe computer programs or other trainings that you would recommend for students he had quite a complex question. The other part of it was, what are the top 5 steps for architectures or grads coming into this? So you can interpret that how you would like. But for those of us who have to, or for those of you who have to leave us right now, since it's top of the hour, thank you so much for joining. For those who can stay for this maybe last question, yeah, Karno, we'd like to hear your thoughts on your advice to folks who are trying to get into this and what resources they might use.
Sure, that is. Let me think of the best way to answer this. Well, so I think in terms of tools and resources, there are plenty, and that's. I think I can share some, and then folks can, maybe Zoe or somebody can put it in the chat. But like Ladybug and Honeybee is a big one, because they're for students to use because it's free. And Chris Mackey and the folks that have been working on this for a while really have put in a lot of effort for integration with Energy Plus and and some of the other tools. So I think it's their Ladybug, Honeybee, there's like Dragonfly and like a bunch of different tools. The other one is Climate Studio, I believe, and most of the softwares that require payment for professionals usually either have a discount or are free for students. And a lot of schools also have signed up to have licenses for these softwares. So for students, it's always a good idea to talk to your peers or professors or folks who teach the sustainability courses in your schools, because they probably at some point engaged, to have licenses available. But Climate Studio is the big one. It's an integrated design tool that includes like site analysis. I think there's some daylighting as well there, and other tools. They keep changing. Climate Consultant's another one. I don't know if Diva is still being used, but that's primarily for daylighting. But I think really, like in addition to tools like I highly recommend Sun, Wind, Light, the book, as really a 101 for as a resource for sustainability. Like it's old school, right? It's a book and all the diagrams are hand drawn, but it's really a good way to understand like the fundamentals. And I guess the second part of Michael's question, maybe a top 5. I don't know, maybe I'll narrow it down to a top 3. It's really to understand, to know your foundations first, to understand the basic principles for sustainability. And that I would say is not software. It's really reading, presentations or Sun, Wind, Light, or books that deal with sustainability to understand the concepts. And then the second part is understanding climate. I think that's the second most important step, whether it's looking at knowing how to read things like a bioclimatic or a psychrometric chart, or how lighting affects certain things. Then the third part is really to look at software and tools, right? So one big discussion point in software is a term called GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. So you put things in that are kind of nonsensical, you're going to get nonsense results. So that's why I think it's really important to understand the fundamentals and to understand what are the data points that you're putting into any software before you use it, so that you're able to get results that make sense to you. So that's my nutshell comment.
And if I could add, Karno, your point again is like your best tool is asking questions and knowing who to ask questions to, and not being shy to. I feel like that's something that's that gets better with time, but it's definitely hard in the beginning.
Yeah.
And I love that point, Karno. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. We're excited to have you all back next month for another presentation. And in the meantime, we will see you at the project showcase next week.